At the far end of Pine Street, where the road curved sharply and the street lamps ended, there stood an old, silent house that no one ever visited, and no one ever really spoke about. It wasn't abandoned in the usual way, with broken windows, or graffiti, or signs of teenagers sneaking in. No, this house had no windows at all. None. It was a tall, narrow thing, dark brown in color, with walls swallowed in ivy that grew thick like veins, wrapping the structure in a green, suffocating grip. Only a single door sat at the front, crooked slightly to one side, its wood cracked and chipped with age. It looked like the kind of place that had been forgotten by time, but somehow it hadn't. Everyone in town knew about it, even if they never admitted it. The last house on Pine Street had been there longer than most people could remember. Some said it had been built during the war. Others claimed it had always been there, even before the rest of the neighborhood existed. Over the years, generations had grown up hearing whispers about it, passed between kids like scary bedtime tales. They called it cursed, haunted, alive. No one really knew what went on inside that place, only that it was always watching. People spoke of a strange feeling that came over them whenever they walked past it. A sudden heaviness in the chest. A shiver, even on warm days. Some described it as the sensation of being followed, of unseen eyes boring into the back of the neck. More than a few said they'd heard faint sounds from behind the ivy-covered walls, soft creaks like footsteps, and sometimes breathing. Low, slow breathing, as though something was pressed right up against the other side of the wood, listening, waiting. Despite all that, there had never been a proper investigation. No real incidents, no crimes reported, no missing people connected to it, just stories. Yet the town had learned to keep their distance. Children were warned not to play near the end of Pine Street. Teenagers sometimes dared each other to run, up and touch the door, but the bravest of them only ever did it once. The house gave something back. Maybe not a voice, maybe not a ghostly figure, but something cold and real. Enough to leave its mark. Then came the stranger. Mark arrived one cloudy Tuesday afternoon. A newcomer with short hair, a backpack, and a camera always hanging from his neck. He was moving into a rental down on Maple Lane, just 2 blocks from Pine Street. No one knew much about him, except that he worked online, kept to himself, and didn't believe in small-town ghost stories. The locals, curious as always, told him about the town's secrets over coffee and beer, including the infamous house with no windows. He listened, smiled politely, then laughed. A real laugh, sharp and short, like someone watching a magic trick, and knowing exactly how it was done. It was during one of those evenings at the local bar that he made the promise. A few people had mentioned the Pine Street legend again, half-jokingly, trying to get a rise out of him. He leaned back in his chair, stretched, and said, loud enough for several tables to hear, "I'm going to spend a night in that house. I'll stream the whole thing. Maybe I'll find some ghosts to interview." The bar went quiet. There was something in the air that night, a weight, a warning. An older man sitting near the jukebox said softly, "No one ever comes out the same, kid." But Mark just grinned. He'd heard it all before. Haunted this, cursed that. He believed in logic, cameras, proof. He thought fear was just imagination stretched too far. The next evening, just before sundown, he packed his things. A flashlight, 2 bottles of water, a bag of chips, a backup battery. His camera, of course, fully charged and set to stream live. He stood at the edge of Pine Street, pointing the lens toward the strange house in the distance. "All right," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Let's meet the ghost." He made his way down the street slowly, the light fading behind him, casting long shadows from the trees. As he approached, the house seemed to shift slightly in the dusk, not physically, but somehow in presence, like it had noticed him. The ivy rustled softly, even though the air was still. The door loomed in front of him, darker than before. He hesitated for just a moment, barely noticeable, but it was there. Then he reached for the handle. The old wood creaked loudly as the door opened, revealing nothing but pitch black inside. No light, no sound, just a cold rush of air that escaped like a breath being exhaled for the first time in years. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him. Several people in town had been watching from the hill at the end of the street. No one said a word. They stayed until the house swallowed him and the door vanished into the shadows. Then they went home. At first, the stream was fine. The inside of the house looked empty. Wooden floors, faded wallpaper, dust dancing in the beam of the flashlight. He talked to the camera, joked, even called out, "Is anybody here?" like a TV ghost hunter. But as the night dragged on, the tone changed. The feed began to glitch. Sounds started to come through. Clicks, soft knocks, then something that might have been breathing. And then, just after 11:54 p.m., the screen froze. The last thing viewers saw was Mark's face turning towards something behind the camera, eyes wide in confusion, maybe fear. Then static. The camera went dead. By morning, he was gone. No one saw him leave. His things were never found. Only his flashlight remained, cracked and cold, lying on the porch like it had been thrown. The door was shut tight. The house stood, the same as ever, windowless, lifeless, and still watching. But something had changed, and Pine Street was quiet again. Too quiet. When the sun rose the next morning over the quiet streets of town, everything appeared normal, at least to those who didn't know what had happened the night before. But for the people who had gathered on the nearby hill to witness Mark's bold challenge, there was a strange, sharp stillness in the air. Word spread quickly, and by early afternoon, whispers filled the local diner, the gas station, and the small hardware store on Main. Mark had gone into the house at the end of Pine Street, and he hadn't come out. The feed from his camera had cut to black sometime around midnight, just after a strange, flickering movement was seen behind him. The town's internet connection wasn't the best, but those watching knew it wasn't a simple glitch. The image had frozen, his face turned sideways in alarm, eyes wide, lips parted like he was about to speak, and then static, followed by silence. No screams, no struggle, just gone. The door had never reopened. A few brave souls ventured down the street in daylight to see for themselves. The house looked as it always had. Tall, plain, wrapped in ivy, no windows, no sound, just the cracked old door sitting heavy on its hinges. But now, something was different. On the wooden porch, directly in front of the door, lay Mark's flashlight. The casing was shattered, the glass bent inward, as if it had been slammed to the ground with force, not dropped. Around it, scattered dust had been disturbed, like something had been dragged, or had tried to crawl, before giving up. The police were called, of course. A missing person report was filed. A patrol car arrived later that day, and 2 officers approached the house with cautious steps, glancing at each other every few seconds. They knocked first, then waited. When nothing responded, they slowly opened the door, weapons drawn, flashlights on. What they found inside made little sense. According to their report, the house contained only a single room. No stairs, no doors, leading elsewhere. Just one room with 4 plain walls, dusty floorboards, and stale, unmoving air. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken furniture, no backpack, no camera. Not even footprints, except for the ones the officers made themselves. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the emptiness. It was the walls. Every inch of them was covered in eyes, hundreds of them. Some painted in faded, peeling color. Some, drawn in charcoal, smeared like they had been done in a rush. Others carved deep into the wood, staring blankly outward with no lids, no expression. They varied in size and style, some narrow and slanted, others wide and round, all facing inward, as though watching the center of the room, where nothing remained but dust. The officers also noted a terrible smell, not of rot or decay, but of earth, like a grave that had been disturbed. They didn't stay long. When they exited, their faces were pale and tight. Their voices clipped as they confirmed there was no sign of Mark. The report ended with a vague recommendation: avoid the structure until further notice. After that day, no one else entered the house. Mark's disappearance was written off as a tragic case of a man who had wandered into an abandoned structure, possibly fallen or gotten lost, though the explanation satisfied no one. There was no basement to fall into, no staircase to lead elsewhere. The house, according to floor plans from Old Town records, had once had 3 rooms, but all of that had vanished. The structure remained as it appeared now: 4 walls, 1 door, no windows. And yet strange things began to happen. A week after Mark vanished, a teenager riding his bike down Pine Street claimed he saw something moving inside the ivy. A hand, pale and thin, brushing against the leaves from the inside out, dragging slowly as he passed. When he looked back, it was gone. A mail carrier refused to deliver to the last 3 houses on Pine Street after hearing whispers in the wind each morning, soft voices saying his name though no one was outside. Others reported flickering lights near the edge of the street, shadows crossing the pavement without a source. Some claimed to see something new on the house: tiny holes in the walls, just above the ivy, small dark circles barely visible from the sidewalk. One man, a local painter named Eric, brought binoculars to investigate. He swore he saw actual eyes, real ones, blinking behind the openings, following his movements. Not dozens, just 1 pair. Mark's blue eyes, the very same eyes he had seen during their only conversation at the bar. No one believed him at first. But Eric refused to walk near the house again, claimed he couldn't sleep for 3 days, said he dreamed of wooden walls closing in, eyes watching from every angle, breath on his neck that smelled like dust and wet soil. After that, Pine Street changed. Slowly, houses were sold, families moved away. Those who stayed learned to cross the street when walking past the old place. Children were forbidden to play near it. Even dogs would tug at their leashes, whining and trembling as they neared the edge of the property. The house stood silent, still, yet always present, always waiting. And inside, if the old stories were true, there was still 1 room, empty, dark, covered in eyes, and perhaps, somewhere in the shadows, someone else now watching, trapped. A man who didn't believe in ghosts, a man who thought he could prove the town wrong, a man who had walked through a door and never walked back out. Weeks passed, and life in the small town continued as if nothing had ever changed. The legend of the house on Pine Street became just another piece of local history, an unsettling story retold in whispers, but largely dismissed by the younger generation. The old stories faded, replaced by new dramas, new concerns. But in the hearts of those who still remembered, a cold dread lingered, an unspoken truth that gnawed at their thoughts. They knew what had happened to Mark. They knew the house had taken him, just as it had taken countless others before him. But no one spoke of it aloud. No one dared to challenge it. It was as though Pine Street had become a boundary, a place no one should cross, a place where the world turned dark and strange. Then, late one evening, when the sky had turned a deep indigo and the stars twinkled softly overhead, a man came to town, a man with eyes too knowing, a voice too calm. He appeared on the doorstep of the local diner, his boots clicking against the pavement with an unsettling rhythm. His name was Thomas, and he claimed to be a private investigator, hired to find the missing. The town had heard of him before, though no one had ever crossed paths with him personally. They knew him as a professional who didn't believe in the supernatural, who dealt only in facts, details, and cold hard evidence. The moment he mentioned Mark's name, a chill went through the room. Some turned their eyes away, some shifted in their seats. But Thomas smiled faintly, as if already knowing what the response would be. The man asked for directions to the last house on Pine Street. No one replied. Not at first. No one wanted to give him the directions. They didn't want anyone else going there. But Thomas wasn't easily discouraged. He was calm, even when the silence stretched on for too long. He turned to the bartender, a man who had lived in town for decades, and asked if he'd seen the house. The bartender didn't respond, but his gaze dropped, his shoulders stiffening. It was the kind of answer that said more than words ever could. "I'll find it myself," Thomas muttered, his tone soft but unwavering. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the investigator was already walking toward Pine Street. His steps were deliberate, his posture straight, and there was an air about him, a confidence that made the wind feel colder. The town was silent as he walked past it. Even the streetlights seemed to flicker, their beams weak, as if unsure of themselves. No one followed him. No one stopped him. The streets had already claimed its price. When Thomas arrived at the house, the air felt thick with a strange pressure, as if the house itself was holding its breath, watching him approach. For a moment, he stopped at the base of the steps, his eyes scanning the dark windows where no light could pierce. He stood there for what seemed like an eternity, as if considering whether to step forward or turn back. But then, with the same calmness that had led him to Pine Street, he climbed the steps. His hand touched the door, and it creaked open as if it had been waiting for him. The house welcomed him like an old friend, the faint smell of earth and dust filling his nostrils. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Inside, the room was unchanged. The same wooden walls, the same stale air, and of course the eyes. Those thousands of eyes, carved and painted and drawn, all staring, unblinking, fixed on the center of the room. He wasn't fazed. He wasn't surprised. He didn't even flinch. He moved through the darkness, his footsteps barely audible as he crossed the room, flashlight cutting through the shadows. He scanned the walls, his eyes flicking from one eye to the next, as if trying to decipher the meaning behind them. But there was no answer, no explanation. Only the overwhelming silence. Only the feeling that the house was waiting. He was there, for an hour, maybe longer, going through every inch of the room, every corner, searching for any sign of Mark. But there was nothing. No sign of struggle. No trace of anyone who had been there before. No evidence that anything had ever happened. It was as if the house had absorbed it all. But then, just as he was about to leave, Thomas felt it. A sudden weight in the air, like a pressure building up in his chest. The temperature dropped, and he knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He turned slowly, his flashlight beam landing on the farthest corner of the room, where a figure now stood, tall, dark, and unmoving. For a moment, he thought it was another person, someone who had been hiding in the shadows. But then he saw the eyes. The figure's eyes weren't human. They were wide, round, and unblinking, like the painted eyes on the walls. But these were alive, staring at him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, staring, waiting. And then, just as Thomas felt the last of his courage slipping away, it spoke, but not in a voice that he could hear. It was more like a thought, cold, sharp, and insistent. Leave. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to back away, but his feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him. The eyes all around him blinked one by one, suddenly alive with a life of their own, and they began to move, following him, closing in. The air grew thick with whispers, too quiet to understand, but too persistent to ignore. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. And in that moment, he knew. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed Mark, just as it had claimed all, the others who had dared to step inside. No one would hear him scream. No one would know what happened to him. He would disappear, like so many before him. The house on Pine Street had no windows, no doors that opened again. And now, it had him. This is the story of Mia, a quiet, thoughtful college girl who took up babysitting to make some extra money on weekends. She had done it many times before. Usually simple work, watching TV after putting a kid to bed, texting friends, maybe doing some homework while keeping an ear out. Nothing exciting ever happened. It was supposed to be easy, and on this particular Friday night, it seemed like just another regular job. That was until she accepted an offer from a woman named Mrs. Elwood. The call had come earlier that week. The woman's voice sounded older, elegant but distant, as if echoing from a different time. She explained that she needed a sitter for just one evening, from 7 p.m. until midnight. Her daughter, Lily, would already be asleep by the time Mia arrived. There would be no feeding, no playtime, no bedtime routine, just watching over the house. Until the parents returned. Mia, thinking of the simple hours and good pay, accepted without hesitation. The address was a place she vaguely recognized. A large house on Pine Street, one of the oldest streets in the town. People didn't talk much about that part of town, mostly because no one really lived there anymore. When Mia arrived that evening, she noticed the street was eerily quiet. The houses were spaced far apart, hidden behind overgrown trees and shadowy fences. As she stood before the tall iron gate of the Elwood house, a strange feeling crept up her spine. The house loomed in front of her, 3 stories tall, with narrow windows covered in heavy velvet curtains. The brickwork was aged and dark, vines crawling along the walls as though trying to pull the house into the ground. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't feel lived in either. The door creaked open just as Mia raised her hand to knock. Standing there was Mrs. Elwood herself, dressed in a long black gown with lace cuffs and a high collar, something that looked like it belonged to the 1800s. Her face was pale, with sharp features and lips painted in deep red. She spoke softly, almost too softly to hear, and greeted Mia with a brief nod. Without much explanation, she showed her the living room, pointed out the staircase that led to Lily's room upstairs, and explained that the child was already fast asleep. Then, with an oddly stiff smile, she gathered her coat, said she would be back at midnight, and walked out the front door, leaving Mia standing alone in the dimly lit foyer. The silence that followed her departure was thick. Mia took a slow breath and looked around. The house was cold, not physically, but emotionally. It felt hollow. She wandered into the living room and was immediately struck by the decor. It wasn't just old, it was ancient. Heavy wooden furniture, dusty shelves filled with leather-bound books, tall grandfather clocks ticking too slowly. But what caught Mia's attention the most were the paintings. They were everywhere. Above the fireplace, along the hallways, even above door frames. Dozens of portraits. Each one captured a different face. Men, women, children. All painted in that old-fashioned, stiff pose, bodies forward, eyes directly at the viewer. Some had soft expressions, others looked grim, and a few carried an expression that made Mia uncomfortable, as if they were looking through the wall behind her. She tried not to pay them much mind. After all, they were just paintings, old ones at that. She sat on the floral-patterned couch and pulled out her phone, planning to scroll through social media or maybe stream a show to pass the time. Hours passed slowly. The tick of the grandfather clock was the only sound breaking the silence. From time to time, Mia glanced toward the hallway, her eyes always catching on one painting in particular, a tall man in a green coat standing next to a stone wall with one hand resting on a cane. His eyes were dark and narrow. She could have sworn he seemed more intense than the rest, but again, she shrugged it off. It was around 10:30 when the first strange thing happened. While sitting quietly on the couch, Mia felt a sudden chill, like a breeze brushing past her cheek. At the same time, she heard something, a whisper, so faint, she wasn't sure she heard anything at all. But it was close, right beside her ear. It wasn't a word at first, just a breath. Then again, this time clearer. "Get out!" She jumped to her feet and spun around. No one was there. The house was still. The air had that same heavy stillness, and all she could hear was the slow ticking of the clock. Her heart thumped as she stared into the shadows around the room. She laughed nervously, trying to calm herself. "Maybe I'm just tired," she muttered. But the moment she looked back at the wall, her smile vanished. The man in the green coat, his eyes were no longer looking to the side. They were staring straight at her. Mia stood frozen, trying to remember. Had he been facing forward the whole time? No. She was sure he had been looking to the left. She took a few slow steps closer. His expression had changed too. It wasn't just the eyes. There was something else. A curve at the corner of his lips. A smile. A smile that hadn't been there before. She backed away, keeping her eyes on the painting. Every instinct told her something was wrong with this house. But still, logic whispered in her ear, "It's just your mind playing tricks. You're imagining things." She moved away from the painting, pretending it didn't bother her, and made her way down the hallway. But the farther she walked, the more paintings she saw on every wall, every turn. They all looked like they were watching. Not like regular portraits, really watching. One painting showed a woman in a wedding dress with a blank stare. Another was of a child with hollow black eyes. A dog, but its face looked human. Her stomach twisted. Who decorated a home like this? Mia looked at her phone. Only 30 minutes to go. Just 30 more minutes. She sat back down, eyes flicking from painting to painting, her nerves tightening. The house was too quiet, too still. And behind every corner, every frame on the wall, she felt the weight of 100 painted eyes watching. The clock struck 11 p.m., and with each slow chime, the house seemed to grow colder. Mia sat frozen on the edge of the couch, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes flicking nervously toward the hallway where the paintings lined the walls, like silent watchers. Her breath felt shallow, each inhale trembling just slightly more than the last. The strange things had started subtly, a whisper, a shifting gaze. But now the air itself felt heavier, almost as if something unseen was moving through it, brushing past her with invisible fingers. She dared not speak aloud, afraid that any sound might awaken something ancient and waiting. When the floorboards upstairs creaked sharply, the noise cut through the silence like a knife. Her head snapped up, heart thundering in her chest. The child, Lily. Mrs. Elwood had said she was already asleep. But what if she had woken up? What if she had gotten out of bed? That seemed more comforting than the alternatives swirling in. Mia's mind. Slowly, cautiously, she stood and made her way to the base of the staircase. The wood groaned beneath her feet, and the silence around her felt almost angry, like the house itself resented the sound. As she climbed each step, she felt the presence of those paintings watching her even from downstairs, their unseen eyes following her ascent. Reaching the landing, she looked down the hallway. The door to Lily's room stood slightly ajar, a pale light leaking from the crack as though someone had turned on the lamp inside. That wasn't right. Mia remembered clearly. It had been dark when she arrived. She approached slowly, every nerve in her body alive with fear. She gently pushed the door open and stepped inside. Lily lay in bed, still asleep, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The lamp beside her was glowing faintly, but there was no sign of movement. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal. Mia turned to leave, but her eyes caught something strange across the room. On the far wall, above a small wooden bookshelf, hung a single painting, a new one she hadn't seen earlier. It depicted a young girl with dark hair, standing in the same room, in the same bed. Her face was expressionless, her hands resting neatly on her lap. Behind her, in the painting, the door was open, and something dark stood just outside the frame, only half visible. Mia blinked and leaned closer. The figure in the background seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the paint hadn't fully dried, or as if it were pulsing faintly beneath the canvas. She shivered and turned away. Enough was enough. Something was very wrong in that house. Descending the stairs, Mia noticed the paintings on the walls had shifted again. The tall man in the green coat was no longer alone in his frame. A second figure now stood beside him, a young woman in a black dress, her face pale and stretched into an unnatural smile. Mia gasped. That woman hadn't been there before. She was certain of it. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she forced herself to keep walking. She needed to leave. Right now. She reached the living room again and grabbed her phone from the coffee table. Midnight couldn't come soon enough. But when she checked the time, her heart nearly stopped. It still read 11:03 p.m. Her phone had frozen. The second hand on the wall clock wasn't moving either. Time itself had stopped. Or something had stopped it. She heard footsteps, soft, careful, just above her head. Her eyes darted toward the ceiling. The creaking was moving, one step at a time, from Lily's room toward the stairs. Mia rushed to the front door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. She hadn't locked it when she came in, had she? Her fingers fumbled to twist the old iron bolt, but it wouldn't move. It felt like it had rusted shut, sealed by something ancient and unseen. Panic began to claw at her chest. She turned to find another way out, but her eyes landed once more on the painting of the tall man and the smiling woman. They were no longer just staring. They were pointing straight at her. A deep, slow knocking echoed through the hallway. Not from the front door, from the inside of the house. From a door she hadn't noticed before, one that blended into the shadows near the far end of the hall. The knocking continued, patient and deliberate. Mia backed away, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. The painting closest to her suddenly cracked, hairline fractures spreading across the glass like spider webs. She jumped as a shard dropped to the floor with a sharp tink. In the painting, the child's mouth had opened, not in a smile, but in a scream. She ran, not knowing where to, just away from that hallway, away from the paintings. She stumbled into a dining room she hadn't seen before. A long table sat in the center, untouched, but the dust on the chairs had been disturbed, as if someone, or something, had recently sat there. The far end of the table held another painting, this, one larger than the rest. It showed the Elwood family, Mr. and Mrs. Elwood, a younger version of Lily, and someone else. Another girl, older, standing slightly apart, her face turned away. Mia squinted at the nameplate below. The Forgotten One. The girl's figure in the painting suddenly moved, just slightly. Her head tilted a fraction toward Mia. And as her face came into view, something inside Mia went cold. It was her own face. The girl in the painting was her. A wave of dizziness hit her, and she backed away, knocking over a chair. As the sound echoed across the empty room, the walls seemed to pulse, breathing in and out, slow and heavy. The shadows stretched longer than they should, reaching for her like hands. She turned and fled once again, her footsteps pounding across the wooden floor. The hallway felt longer now, stretched unnaturally, like a dream turned nightmare. Every painting she passed had changed. Eyes widened in terror, mouths open mid-scream, faces pressed against the inside of the glass like they were trying to escape. And behind them, dark shapes, tall and thin, staring back from inside the frames. Mia collapsed onto the living room floor, shaking, breathless, eyes wild. She grabbed her phone again. Still frozen. Still 11:03 p.m. Her reflection in the black screen stared back at her, but something was wrong with it. The reflection smiled, but she wasn't smiling. Her fingers dropped the phone. Her body wouldn't respond. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, from the top of the stairs, a soft giggle echoed down into the silence. The giggle echoed again, sharp and high-pitched, coming from the darkened staircase above. Mia's blood ran cold as the sound seemed to twist and stretch, wrapping itself around her like a chain, pulling her closer to the source of the sound. She tried to scream, but her mouth remained sealed shut, the air thick with the weight of something pressing down on her chest. Her vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, she could see that the walls were no longer just filled with paintings. They were alive, moving like a living, breathing thing. The faces in the frames weren't just staring anymore. They were reaching out, as if the paint itself had become a trap, a doorway into the nightmare world she had walked into. Her breath caught in her throat, and she staggered backward, her legs failing to support her. The giggle came again, this time from the end of the hallway, just outside the room with the front door. There, standing at the threshold, was a figure she hadn't seen before, tall and thin, its body casting a long shadow that stretched across the walls, merging with the darkness itself. The figure had no face, just a smooth, featureless mask that reflected no light. Mia felt the presence before she saw it, an overwhelming sense of dread that crawled up her spine like icy fingers. Her heart pounded harder with each breath, and her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle. Again, only to find that it had somehow become impossibly cold, as if frozen from the inside out. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, its presence filling the space around her like an expanding fog. But then it tilted its head, slowly, as if studying her. In that moment, Mia realized that it wasn't the figure that was moving. It was the room itself, the space around her warping and bending, the walls stretching, the air thickening. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat now, each beat louder, faster. The house was alive, and it was closing in on her. She turned and ran, desperation fueling her every step. The sound of her feet slapping against the floor seemed to echo far too loudly, reverberating through the house, as if everything was amplifying her fear. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay in the living room any longer. As she sprinted down the hallway, she passed the stairs again, and this time, she saw something that made her blood run even colder. The paintings weren't just alive anymore. They were growing, the images inside them shifting and merging with the walls. Faces pressed against the glass, distorted and contorted in agony, their eyes wide with terror. The tall man and the woman in the green coat had been replaced. Now a dark shape filled the frames, a twisted, monstrous figure, its limbs elongated and unnatural, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. The woman's face was gone, replaced by a mouth so wide it looked like it could swallow the entire room. Mia wanted to scream, but her voice betrayed her. The hallway seemed endless, and no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the paintings, the whispers, the eyes that followed her every move. She reached the end of the hallway again and found herself standing in front of a door she had never seen before. A door so old and covered in dust that it seemed to have been there for centuries. The handle was a brass knob, tarnished with age. She turned it with trembling hands, and the door creaked open to reveal a small, dimly lit room. Inside, the air was thick with a smell she couldn't quite place. Damp, moldy, and something faintly metallic, like blood. In the center of the room stood a large, antique mirror. the kind of mirror you would expect to see in a museum or a haunted house. The frame was dark wood, intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to move when you looked at them too long. She stepped closer to the mirror, drawn to it like a magnet, though every instinct in her screamed to run. As she gazed into its surface, she saw not her own reflection, but the room behind her, the hallway, the door, the floorboards beneath her feet. But something was wrong. The reflection in the mirror was distorted, the walls bending and stretching, in impossible ways, like they were being pulled apart by some unseen force. And then, in the reflection, she saw something else, something moving in the corner of the room. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw a figure step into view, the same figure from the hallway, the one without a face. It stood motionless, its head slowly tilting as it studied her. Mia's breath caught in her throat. The figure reached out toward the mirror, its hand passing through the glass as if it weren't even there. And then, it was reaching for her. Mia staggered backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to get out. She had to leave. But the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside the room. Panic surged through her, and she scrambled for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The door was locked, and the room was shrinking, the walls pressing in, the air growing thinner and colder. The figure was getting closer now, its hand slowly moving toward her, its long, thin fingers stretching further with each passing second. Mia's heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she could hardly hear anything else, the sound deafening her, drowning her in terror. She reached out for the mirror again, as if somehow she could escape into it, but the glass was cold, slick, under her fingertips, offering no way out. The figure's hand was inches from her face now, and she could feel the weight of its presence, the chill of its skin pressing against her. The mask-like face was still blank, but she could feel its gaze, its cold, empty gaze boring into her soul. It was going to take her. She wasn't going to make it out. Then, just as the figure's fingers brushed her cheek, the lights flickered, and the world seemed to freeze. The room went still. The walls stopped closing in. The figure vanished. The door clicked open. Mia collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her body shaking with the aftermath of the terror that had nearly consumed her. She didn't know how long she lay there, but when she finally stood up, the house had returned to its eerie silence. The paintings were still, the giggle gone. The air felt empty. She stumbled out of the room, down the hallway and into the living room, but something felt different now. The paintings no longer followed her movements. The house was still, but there was something else. The air was thick with an unspoken promise, as though the house was waiting for something, waiting for her to leave. And when Mia reached the front door again, she didn't hesitate. She didn't stop to look back. She ran out into the night, never once looking over her shoulder, her heart still racing, knowing that the house had claimed her, and whatever was trapped inside those paintings would never truly let her go. This is the story of something that happened to a man named Raj, a quiet man in his late 20s who had just started living alone for the first time. He had recently moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, away from the noise and chaos of the main roads. The building was old but well kept, with long, narrow hallways and flickering yellow lights that buzzed faintly during the night. Raj had always enjoyed solitude, the kind that came with empty streets and silent rooms. It gave him time to think, to breathe, and to escape the stress of everyday life. But on one particular night, that silence turned into something else. Something heavy, strange, and terrifying. It was around 2:45 in the morning when Raj finally put down his phone and turned off the bedside lamp. The room fell into darkness, and the only sound was the soft humming of the ceiling fan spinning above. Sleep was just beginning to pull him under when a sound broke through the stillness. Ding dong. The doorbell. a single clear ring. Raj sat up, slowly, heart already beating a little faster. Who would be ringing someone's doorbell in the middle of the night? He thought maybe it was a mistake. Perhaps someone was drunk or lost. Maybe they hit the wrong apartment number. He waited, hoping the silence would return and the night would go back to normal. But after 10 seconds, the sound came again. Ding dong. This time, the ring felt longer, more deliberate. Not rushed, not accidental. It was as if someone was waiting on the other side, calm and certain. Raj slid out of bed, barefoot, and padded softly across the cold floor. He didn't turn on any lights. A strange instinct told him to stay quiet, to stay hidden. He moved to the door and looked through the peephole. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. No one was there. The hallway was completely empty, just like it always was. No footsteps, no voices, not even a shadow. He waited for a moment longer, trying to make sense of what he had heard. Maybe someone had rung the wrong bell and already walked away. Maybe it was just a late-night delivery mix-up. But then something urged him to unlock the door. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. Something he couldn't name. Against better judgment, he unlatched the locks and opened the door just a crack, barely enough to peek through. At first, there was still nothing. The hallway stretched out in both directions, quiet and lifeless. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a figure standing just beyond the left side of the doorframe, where the building's security camera had a blind spot. It was a woman. Pale skin, long black hair that hung like wet strings, and a torn white dress that looked like it belonged to another time. Her arms hung loosely by her sides, and her bare feet were planted on the cold concrete floor. But the strangest part, she wasn't looking at Raj. Her head was tilted down, chin almost touching her chest, as though she were asleep on her feet. Raj's breath caught in his throat. He didn't speak. He didn't even move. The woman didn't either. She stood perfectly still, the air around her almost frozen. And then, without lifting her head, she spoke in the softest, slowest whisper. "Can I come in?" The voice was wrong. Not angry, not loud, but too soft, too quiet, as if the words didn't belong in this world. They crept out from her lips like smoke hanging in the air far too long. Raj didn't answer. He couldn't. His instinct screamed at him to shut the door, to lock everything, to turn away. He slammed the door without another word, locked all 3 locks with shaking hands, and backed away slowly. Every step away from the door felt like a mile, and still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing there, waiting, back. In his room, he turned on every light. His apartment, once a place of peace, now felt like a trap. He sat on the bed, back against the wall, heart racing like a drum. Every creak, every sound outside the window made him flinch. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. And the worst part? He never heard footsteps, never heard her leave. No movement, no goodbye. Just silence. Thick, heavy silence that made his skin crawl. When the sun finally rose and the morning light filtered through the curtains, Raj dared to open the door again. The hallway looked the same as always, plain, boring, and harmless. But something was different now. It felt like the air carried something it didn't before, like something unseen had stepped into his world, and it wasn't planning to leave. That was the first night. The night he heard the doorbell at 3 a.m., the night he answered. The night he let something strange and cold into his life, and from that point on, nothing was ever quite the same. The days after the doorbell incident felt like a blur, and even though Raj tried to convince himself that it was just a bad dream, a figment of his overactive imagination, The feeling that something wasn't right never left him. The apartment felt colder, emptier, even when he turned the heat up and left the windows shut. At night, the silence became deafening, pressing against him like a thick, invisible weight. Raj had lived alone for years before, but now, for the first time, the quiet seemed oppressive. The shadows in his apartment began to stretch further, and the corners of the rooms appeared darker, as if they were hiding something just beyond the edge of sight. He couldn't get the image of the woman out of his mind. Her pale skin, her long dark hair hanging like a curtain, and the way she had stood there, unmoving, her head down. The voice she had whispered with, that soft, eerie tone, echoed in his thoughts, haunting him when he tried to sleep, when he tried to focus on anything. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the moment that stood out the most was the one when she asked to come in. Those words were like a curse, a spell that lingered in the air long after she was gone, and Raj couldn't shake the feeling that answering her doorbell was the mistake that opened the door to something he couldn't escape. The days passed, and Raj began to tell himself that he was overreacting. It had been a strange encounter, but maybe it wasn't supernatural. Maybe it was just some prank. But deep down, he knew that what he had felt wasn't normal. What he had seen wasn't a simple trick. Something about it had been wrong in a way he couldn't explain, and now that feeling had rooted itself deep in his chest, growing heavier by the day. It was a week later when the first sign of something truly terrifying happened. Raj had just finished a long day at work, and he came home late, exhausted. The apartment felt unusually warm, but his tiredness kept him from thinking much of it. He kicked off his shoes and dropped his bag by the door, heading straight to the kitchen to grab a quick bite to eat. The night felt quiet, just like the others, and he figured it was going to be like any normal evening, lonely but uneventful. As he sat down to eat, his phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. Raj picked it up, expecting a message from a friend or a reminder about something at work. But the message was from an unknown number. It simply read, "I'm waiting." His heart skipped a beat, and he felt a chill creep up his spine. Raj stared at the phone, trying to make sense of the message. It didn't come with any context, no other words, nothing else to explain it. He considered blocking the number, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was just spam or some kind of random text from an app. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was her, that somehow she was already watching him. Shaking off the unease, Raj got up and moved to the living room. The lights flickered for a split second, and he paused. He had never had issues with the wiring before, and it wasn't stormy outside. It was as if the electricity was being interrupted, but not in the usual way. The flickering stopped, but that sinking feeling didn't. It only deepened. As he settled on the couch, trying to calm his racing thoughts, Raj heard something else. It wasn't loud, it wasn't immediate, but he noticed it. A sound. A soft thud, followed by a dragging noise that came from the hallway just outside his door. It was subtle at first, almost like footsteps, or rather, something heavier dragging across the floor. His breath caught in his throat. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he sat frozen, staring at the hallway from the corner of his eye, but not daring to look directly. Then came the knock. One knock. It was so soft, he might have imagined it, but it was unmistakable. A knock at the door. Raj's stomach twisted, his mouth going dry. He stared at the door for a moment, trying to find the courage to move, but his body wouldn't respond. His mind screamed at him to ignore it, to just stay still and let the night pass without another glance. But the part of him that couldn't resist the need to know, the part of him that had opened the door that first night, finally won. He got up slowly, each step toward the door like 1,000 pounds of weight dragging him down. When he reached the door, he hesitated. He couldn't see through the peephole from this angle, and he didn't dare open the door even a crack. Instead, he just listened. The quiet was oppressive, as if the whole building was holding its breath. He stood there for what felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a minute. Then, suddenly, the handle started to turn. Raj froze. He felt the coldness creeping from the other side, as if something, or someone, was trying to force its way in. The door didn't open, but the pressure on the handle was undeniable. He backed away from the door, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was another text. The same number, the same message. "I'm still waiting." His pulse quickened. He had to get out. He couldn't stay in this apartment any longer, not after what had happened the night before, not after the things he was hearing now. But every time he tried to leave, the weight of something unseen seemed to push against him, keeping him locked, in place. The tension in the air was so thick, so suffocating, that it felt like the walls were closing in. Raj glanced one last time at the door, his hand trembling as it reached for the handle. He wanted to open it. He wanted to see. But something inside him, the last sliver of rationality, held him back. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he stayed in the living room, lights on, eyes wide open, watching the door, listening for anything at all. But it was silent, completely silent. The hours dragged on, and the only sound that filled the apartment was the beat of his own heart. By morning, he still hadn't moved. He couldn't leave, couldn't sleep. And worst of all, he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still waiting, still watching, waiting for him to make the wrong move, waiting for him to open the door. And deep down, Raj knew he would never be able to escape her. The next few days felt like a never-ending nightmare, with Raj sinking deeper into fear and isolation. The days were blurry, marked only by the occasional daylight that filtered through the curtains, a stark contrast to the dark thoughts that clung to him. He tried to go back to his normal life, to ignore the creeping dread that had taken root in his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of being watched. The text messages continued to arrive, always, from the same unknown number, always with the same chilling words. "I'm still waiting." Each time, Raj felt the darkness press closer, felt the walls of his apartment grow tighter around him. It seemed like every time he tried to ignore the messages, every time he tried to forget, they only grew more persistent. They began to show up at odd times, after midnight, at 3 a.m., always when he was alone, always when he thought he might finally be able to relax. It wasn't just the messages anymore. There were other things too. Things that weren't there before. Strange sounds at night, like the scratching of nails against the floor, the faintest whispers that carried through the walls as if someone was speaking just behind him. But when he looked, when he tried to find the source, there was nothing but empty rooms and silence. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Raj returned to his apartment, his body aching from the weight of exhaustion. His mind had been clouded with worry all day. He couldn't focus, couldn't think clearly. The events of the past week had taken their toll on him, but what worried him the most wasn't the odd messages or the feeling of being watched. It was the growing sense that he was losing his grip on reality. Everything felt unreal, like he was living in a dream from which he couldn't wake up. He opened the door to his apartment, the familiar scent of his place, the faint smell of dust and old wood, greeting him. For a moment, everything seemed calm, but that calm was short-lived. As Raj entered, he noticed something out of place. The hallway lights flickered again, just like before, but this time, the light didn't stop. It flashed erratically, almost, as if something was interfering with the electrical circuit. and Raj felt an unsettling chill crawl up his spine. He turned back toward the door, locking it with shaky hands, and glanced at the hallway, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just darkness. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. The same unknown number. This time, the message read, "I'm here." Raj's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in days, he felt something close to terror. He had no idea what that meant. No idea who it was or how they knew where he was. Panic started to set in. His palms grew clammy, and the room seemed to close in on him. He checked the locks again, making sure everything was secure. His thoughts raced. The door, the hallway, the strange, cold presence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Was she still out there? Was this all some kind of cruel joke? Or had he unknowingly invited something terrifying into his life? He couldn't keep running. He had to face it. He grabbed a flashlight from a drawer, holding it tightly in his hand. Slowly, he moved toward the hallway, his breath shallow, his mind screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Not after everything that had happened. He had to know what was happening. He had to know who or what had been tormenting him for so long. As he reached the hallway, his heart pounded louder in his chest. The flickering lights cast shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. Raj's eyes darted from corner to corner, but there was nothing there. Just emptiness. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He moved cautiously, flashlight trembling in his hand as he walked toward the door at the end of the hall. It felt as if each step took forever, as if the hallway itself was stretching, pulling him further away from reality. When he reached the door, he hesitated. The knob was cold beneath his fingers. His mind screamed at him to turn back, but something inside him, something dark, pushed him forward. With a deep breath, he twisted the knob and pushed the door open. What he saw on the other side was something he could never have prepared for. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room. It was an old wooden chair, worn down with age, and it faced directly toward the door. But that wasn't what made Raj's blood run cold. What made his heart stop was the woman sitting in the chair. She was there, the same woman from the night she had knocked on his door. Her skin was pale and lifeless, her black hair hanging in front of her face like a curtain. She wasn't looking at him, but he could feel her presence in the room. It was suffocating, like a weight pressing against his chest. He stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. The flashlight slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, its light flickering out. The woman slowly lifted her head, and for the first time, Raj saw her face. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, the whites of them glowing faintly in the dim light. But her eyes, there was something wrong with them. They weren't human. They were cold, lifeless, like the eyes of something that had long since ceased to be alive. A deep, hollow emptiness stared back at him, and he felt himself drawn into those eyes, unable to break free. She whispered again, her voice like a ghost, carried on the wind. "I'm here." You answered. Raj felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled back, his mind spinning, his heart hammering against his chest. Everything inside him screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The woman stood up slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though her body was no longer fully connected to the world around her. She took a step toward him, then another, and Raj felt his breath catch in his throat. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the apartment, and for a moment everything was silent. Then the whisper came again, louder this time, as if it was right next to his ear. "You can't leave." Raj's mind was no longer his own. The darkness in the room seemed to swallow everything, consuming him. His thoughts scattered, and he could feel the weight of something pressing against him, suffocating him, as if the room itself was closing in. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. He was trapped. And that was when he realized the truth that had been staring at him all along. The woman wasn't just waiting for him to open the door. She had been there all along, in the darkness, in the silence. And now that he had answered, now that he had let her in, he would never escape. Not from her. Not from the curse he had unknowingly invited into his life. Raj wasn't sure how much time passed after that. It could have been hours, days, or mere seconds. All he knew was that the darkness was closing in, and he was no longer in control. He had answered the door, and now there was no way out. It was the first real break I had gotten in a long time. A chance to get away from the daily grind, to disconnect from everything, work, emails, the stress that had slowly been building up in my life. So, I decided to take a solo camping trip. A retreat into nature seemed like the perfect way to clear my mind and recharge. I had been hiking before, in different parts of the country, but this time I chose a spot deep in the mountains, far from the beaten path. It was supposed to be a quiet and peaceful place, a haven for those who wanted solitude. I hadn't heard much about it from others, but that only intrigued me more. It felt like the kind of adventure I needed. When I arrived at the campsite, there were a few cabins scattered around, each belonging to different rangers who managed the area. They were the kind of people you'd expect to find in such a remote place, rugged, experienced, and with a certain air of mystery about them. I could tell they had stories, but they didn't share them easily. I made my way up to one of the cabins to check in, and that's when I met them, the forest rangers. One of the rangers, an older man with a grizzled face and a thick salt and pepper beard, was sitting in a folding chair outside the cabin. He had a cigar hanging from his lips and a look in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't the kind of person you'd want to mess with. The other ranger, a woman probably in her early 30s, stood nearby, her arms crossed, watching me with a curious yet cautious gaze. She was more approachable, her youthful face framed by a messy ponytail. Still, there was something about her, something unspoken that made me uneasy. When I told them my plans, that I was going to hike the infamous Trail 13, the older man's expression changed. It wasn't the usual professional kind of concern you'd expect from someone who was used to dealing with hikers. No, this was different. His eyes narrowed, and he stared at me like he was sizing me up. The younger ranger stepped forward then, her voice quiet but firm. "You sure about that trail? It's not what you think." I chuckled, trying to dismiss it. After all, I had hiked on some pretty challenging trails before. What could possibly be so special about this one? But the look on their faces told me it was more than just the usual watch out for wild animals warning. There was a weight to their words, something heavy, like a warning that stretched beyond the simple fact that it was just another trail in the wilderness. "You don't understand," the older ranger finally said, his voice rough like gravel. "Trail 13, it's not like the others. It's got a history. Some people come back from it, but not all of them come back the same." He paused, eyeing me carefully. "You don't want to mess with it. Trust me." I wasn't sure if it was his serious tone or the almost palpable tension in the air, but a strange feeling crept over me. I'd heard stories before, rumors of strange things happening in the woods, of people disappearing or getting lost. I didn't think much of it. After all, people say things about places like this all the time, especially when they've been out in the wilderness too long. But the young ranger didn't seem to be joking either. She gave me a quick, almost apologetic glance and whispered, Just stay away from Trail 13. It's not worth it. You can camp here, sure, but there are other trails." Despite the warning, I couldn't help but feel a pull toward that very trail. There was something about the mystery of it, the way the two rangers looked at me, that made me want to prove I could handle it. Maybe it was a bit of youthful arrogance, or maybe it was just the allure of the unknown. But whatever it was, I dismissed their concerns, thanked them for their advice, and set off in the direction of Trail 13 with my backpack strapped tightly to my back. I didn't think much of it at first. The woods were beautiful, the air fresh, and the sound of the leaves crunching beneath my boots was soothing. I followed the well-marked path, marveling at the towering trees and the distant call of birds, wondering what had made the rangers so uneasy. As I walked deeper into the forest, the air seemed to grow colder, though the temperature hadn't really dropped. The sunlight became dappled, filtering through the thick canopy of branches above, casting strange shadows along the trail. The deeper I ventured, the more I began to notice how silent everything had become. The normal hum of nature, the rustle of the wind, the songs of the birds, seemed to fade into an eerie quiet. At first, I chalked it up to being in a remote area. But as I walked further, something started to feel off. There was no noise, no movement, nothing. I stopped and looked around, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of life. But there was nothing. No rustling of animals, no breeze, just an unsettling stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced down at my map, trying to make sense of where I was. But that's when I noticed something strange. The trail I was walking on didn't match the one on the map. The trees and landmarks I thought I recognized were gone, replaced by unfamiliar surroundings. I turned in a circle, trying to orient myself, but the forest had changed. What had once been a clearly marked path now seemed like a maze. I could barely make out the familiar markings on the trees that would guide me back. Panic started to creep in, but I pushed it down. I had been on tougher trails. I'd find my way. I had to. The deeper I went, the more I realized I was lost. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard it. A voice. Low, almost a whisper, as if coming from just beyond the trees. It wasn't a human voice, at least not one I could recognize. It was too soft, too strange. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Nothing but the silence and that strange voice. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was the wind or my imagination playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And that's when the ranger's warning hit me, like a slap across the face. They had known. They had known something I didn't. Something about this place. Something that was too dangerous to ignore. But it was too late. I had already stepped into something I couldn't easily escape from. As the silence deepened around me, the unease that had begun as a whisper slowly grew into something I couldn't ignore. I should have turned back when I first noticed the strange feeling in the air, but stubbornness kept me moving forward. Every step I took felt heavier, like the forest was absorbing my energy, draining me. The ground had become muddier, the trail narrower, and the trees had started to loom overhead like silent sentinels, blocking out more of the sunlight with every passing moment. I could still make out the faint path in front of me, but it felt as if the trail was deliberately trying to lead me astray, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. My map no longer lined up with the land around me. The trail I had been following had begun to change, and I couldn't figure out where it was supposed to lead. I stopped and pulled out my map again, studying it with growing frustration. The landmarks were all wrong. Where I expected to see the familiar clearing or stream, there was only thick underbrush and towering trees. I thought back to the ranger's warning, wondering if this was what they meant. I should have listened, I told myself, but it was too late now. I had to keep going. The sound of my own breathing became louder in my ears as I tried to think clearly. Should I try to retrace my steps? But everything around me looked unfamiliar, as if the woods had swallowed up any trace of the path I had walked on. A sharp, sudden movement from the corner of my eye made me freeze. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there, just the shifting shadows of the trees. The wind rustled the leaves above, but that didn't ease the tension that had settled deep in my stomach. The woods were too quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't natural. There was no rustling of animals in the brush, no chirping of birds, nothing. The silence had grown heavier, like the very forest itself was holding its breath. I kept walking, my pace quickening as I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The farther I went, the more disoriented I felt. The trees felt different now, as if they were closing in around me, their trunks thickening and twisting in unnatural ways. The ground beneath me seemed to change too, from solid earth to patches of slick, soft mud. I tried to stay calm, but my mind kept racing. It wasn't just the strange shift in the environment that bothered me. It was the growing sense of being trapped, of being pulled deeper into the woods, further from safety. I had been on enough trails to know that this wasn't normal. The sense of isolation had taken on an almost oppressive weight, like something was waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. But I couldn't stop now, not without knowing what was ahead. Then came the whisper again, faint and distant, so soft that I thought it was the wind at first. But as it grew clearer, it felt as though the voice was inside my head. It wasn't a voice I recognized, not a sound that could belong to any living creature. It was cold, distant, and almost disembodied. "You shouldn't be here," it said, the words floating through the air like a chill, freezing the blood in my veins. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. I glanced around wildly, trying to make sense of it. There was no one in sight, no one around. The trees, the shadows, the eerie silence, they were all I could see. I took a step back, my hands trembling as I gripped my backpack straps tightly. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, or the wind playing tricks on me. But the voice was unmistakable. I felt its weight in my chest, like a dark presence closing in around me. With a forced breath, I pushed myself forward, though every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave. The trail had become a labyrinth of shadows and tangled roots. The trees seemed to be pressing in, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural patterns, and the air felt thicker, colder. My footsteps were muffled by the soft earth, but I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. The whisper came again, this time louder, closer, like it was right behind me. "Turn back," the voice urged, but there was no one to be seen. The sound was hollow, as if it echoed from deep within the earth itself. The panic set in then, the kind of fear that twists the stomach into knots and tightens the chest. I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes watching me, though I couldn't see anything. It wasn't just a trick of the mind. There was something else in the forest, something that I had disturbed by simply stepping onto Trail 13. I was no longer just a hiker lost in the woods. I was something else's prey, and I could feel it closing in. That's when I saw them. Figures, pale and tall, standing motionless between the trees. They didn't move, but their presence was undeniable. They were shadows, but with a strange glow that made them seem otherworldly. At first, I thought I was seeing things, the result of too much isolation or a trick of the light. But as I blinked, they remained. Tall, thin figures with elongated limbs, their faces obscured in the darkness of the trees. I couldn't make out details, but their eyes, those wide, empty eyes, stared at me. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, though the trees around me were still. I felt a low hum in my bones, a vibration I couldn't explain, as if the forest itself was alive and reacting to my presence. The figures didn't speak. They didn't move. But I could feel them watching me, waiting for something. The whispering voice, now louder and clearer, came again, more insistent than before, as if the forest itself was trying to communicate with me, to warn me. Leave, or stay forever. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating in the air like a curse. I couldn't take it anymore. Panic took over, and I turned sharply, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the forest. But as I turned, the trail, the very path I had been following, was gone. The trees had shifted again, and the way I had come from was now nothing but a thick wall of brambles and tangled roots. It was as if the woods had swallowed the trail whole, hiding it from me. The figures, still standing just beyond the trees, began to move then. Slow, deliberate steps, but they didn't approach me. Instead, they seemed to be watching me closely, like they were waiting for me to make the first move. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, unable to take my eyes off them. My mind raced. This wasn't just some strange twist of fate. The rangers had known something. They had warned me, and now I knew why. But it was too late. I was in the heart of the forest, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. I stumbled, backward, panic surging through my veins as I tried to find my way out. But the forest had already begun to close around me. The path was gone, the figures were watching, and I had no idea which direction to go. The whispering voice returned, colder than before, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The woods didn't want me to leave. The night had come without warning, enveloping everything in thick darkness. I could barely see my hands in front of my face, the forest now completely submerged in the blackness of night. Panic had gripped me tightly, and no matter how hard, I tried to calm myself. My breathing was shallow and erratic. The eerie silence of the forest was now deafening, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Each step I took felt like an eternity, as if the ground beneath me had a mind of its own, shifting and pulling me deeper into the woods. I had no sense of direction. The trees, now towering even more menacingly, blocked out any trace of the moon. There was no escape in sight. The feeling of being watched had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was always just behind me, lurking in the shadows. I stumbled forward, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot now my only companion in the void. Sweat poured down my face, the chill of the night doing nothing to ease the heat that had built up in my body. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain that something was following me. The shadows among the trees flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure moving between the trunks. It was tall, slender, and its movements were unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by strings. My breath hitched as I quickened my pace, refusing to turn around, terrified that if I looked, I might see something I couldn't handle. The whispering voice had stopped, but the silence in its wake was suffocating. I could still feel the presence of the figures, the pale, glowing shapes that had stood silently between the trees, watching me with those empty, hollow eyes. I had seen them move, slow and deliberate, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake. Now, they were gone, but I didn't feel any safer. In fact, I felt more exposed, more vulnerable. I couldn't help but think that they were still out there, watching me, waiting for me to slip up. My mind raced with thoughts of what might be lurking in the woods, beyond the edges of my vision, beyond the trees that stretched like endless walls around me. As I pushed myself forward, trying to ignore the growing panic, I stumbled upon something unexpected, a small clearing, barely wide enough for me to stand in. The trees opened up, and for the first time in what felt like hours, there was a slight break in the canopy above. The faintest sliver of moonlight filtered through, casting a pale glow over the moss-covered ground. I was desperate for any sign of safety, anything that could lead me back to the main trail. But as I stood there, breathing heavily, I realized that this was no ordinary clearing. Something about it felt wrong. The air was too still, the silence too perfect. Even the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the occasional animal, scurrying through the underbrush, had been replaced by an unnatural calm. It was as if the entire forest had held its breath. My gaze drifted to the center of the clearing, and there, standing in the middle of it, was an old stone monument. It was tall and weathered, covered in thick moss and creeping vines. The stone was cracked, as if time itself had tried to break it down, but the markings on its surface were still visible, faint symbols that didn't make sense to me. They were too intricate, too alien, to be anything I recognized. The edges of the monument were sharp and uneven, as though it had been placed there long before anyone ever set foot in this forest. I couldn't explain why, but there was something about it that felt ancient, something that made my skin crawl as I stared at it. The longer I looked, the more unsettled I became. I couldn't place it, but it felt like the monument was part of the forest's dark secret, a key to something that had been hidden here for centuries. A chill ran down my spine as I took a hesitant step toward it. Suddenly, I felt a sharp tug at my ankle. I yelped in surprise, looking down to see a thick vine wrapped around my leg. It tightened with a force that made me stumble. I tried to yank, my foot free, but the vine only seemed to pull harder, dragging me toward the monument. Panic surged in my chest, and I struggled desperately to free myself, my hands shaking as I tried to pry the vine away. But the more I fought, the tighter it wound around me. The earth beneath me seemed to shift again, and I realized that the ground was no longer solid. The dirt had softened, and the area around the monument was sinking, like quicksand. I pulled harder, fear seizing every muscle in my body. But it was no use. The vines tightened around my legs, pulling me closer to the stone, and for the first time, I noticed something else. Shadows were emerging from the trees. The pale figures. They were there, watching from the edge of the clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on me. They didn't move. Not yet. But I could feel their presence growing, closing in on me, just beyond my reach. I was no longer just trapped by the vines. I was trapped in the middle of the forest with those things watching me, and I had no way of escaping. In that moment, I knew I had made a grave mistake. The warnings of the rangers, the rumors of Trail 13, everything they had said made sense now. I had ventured too deep into a place that shouldn't have been disturbed. The monument, the vines, the figures, all of it was part of something older than the forest itself, something dark and hungry. The forest didn't want me here. It had never wanted anyone here. And as the vines continued to pull me toward the monument, I realized that I wasn't just a lost hiker. I was part of a story, a forgotten tale that the forest kept hidden, and no one had ever left Trail 13 alive. I could feel the cold, dark power of the woods closing in around me, suffocating me, and I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The shadows were growing, stretching, becoming more tangible as they reached out toward me. I tried to scream, but the sound got stuck in my throat. I could hear the whispering again, louder now, swirling around me like a storm. "You shouldn't have come." The words were no longer a warning. They were a verdict, a promise that I would never leave the forest, not alive, not with my mind intact. The forest had claimed its next victim, and it had been waiting for me all along. The shadows reached out, and as I was pulled deeper into the grip of the woods, I knew that no one would ever hear my story. Not from me, not from anyone. The forest had spoken, and I was its newest prisoner, lost forever in the dark. Twisted Heart of Trail 13. It was a typical Saturday evening, just like any other. The day had been full of the usual routine, but there was one thing that stood out. A new game had come out that Max couldn't stop talking about. He was my older brother, someone who had always been into video games, but this one, Infinity Realms, seemed to capture his attention like nothing else ever had. He'd spent days preparing for it, reading up on reviews, watching trailers, and joining forums to discuss every little detail. He said the game was revolutionary, something that would change the way we looked at virtual reality. It wasn't just about playing a game, it was about being in it. The graphics were beyond anything he'd ever seen before. "You won't believe it until you try it," he'd said to me countless times. At first, I shrugged it off as just another game that he'd get bored of in a few weeks, like all the others. He'd always been obsessed with games that promised something extraordinary, only for the hype to die down once the novelty wore off. But this one seemed different. The way he described Infinity Realms, it wasn't just about fighting monsters or completing quests. It was about fully immersing yourself in a world that felt real. He told me the developers had made it so that when you logged in, you didn't just play a character, you became that character. Everything around you felt alive, every detail down to the tiniest leaf moving in the wind. Max had spent hours setting up his account, tweaking his avatar, and reading through the game's manual to make sure he didn't miss anything important. He was obsessed, but I thought, it's just another game. It'll pass. I was in my room scrolling through social media when he finally told me he was going to play Infinity Realms for the night. He promised he'd only be on for an hour, just enough time to get a feel for the game. It was already late, close to midnight, and I was tired. "All right, Max," I called out to him from my room. "I'm going to bed. Don't stay up too late." He didn't answer, but I could hear the familiar sound of his keyboard clicking and the hum of his computer as he settled into his chair. I fell asleep not long after that, the usual noise of the house settling in around me. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. It was a soft, muffled sound coming from Max's room. It wasn't the usual clicking of his mouse or the rapid tapping of keys. No. This sound was quieter, almost as if someone was whispering or mumbling. I tried to ignore it, but the noise persisted, like a low murmur drifting through the walls. Unable to sleep, I threw off the covers and decided to check on him. Maybe he'd fallen asleep at his desk or something. I opened the door to his room and saw him sitting there, still as a statue. His face was bathed in the eerie glow of the computer screen. He wasn't moving. His eyes were fixed on the monitor, but he didn't even seem to see me standing there. I called out his name, but he didn't react. "Max? Hey, Max?" I said, stepping closer. His fingers were still gripping the mouse, and his hands were frozen in place, but his eyes remained locked on the screen. It was as if he couldn't hear me, or maybe he didn't even know I was there. That's when I noticed something strange. The game on the screen wasn't like it had been before. It looked the same in terms of graphics, clear and vivid, but there was something unsettling about it. The screen didn't show the usual menu or loading screen. Instead, there was a message in bold text at the top. "You have entered Infinity Realms. You cannot log out until the game ends." I stared at the words, trying to make sense of what I was reading. You cannot log out. That couldn't be right. Max had played hundreds of games before, and none of them had ever said something like that. I tried shaking him, but his body felt stiff, unresponsive, like he was in some kind of trance. I called his name again, louder this time, but still no response. His eyes didn't blink. He didn't even breathe, or so it seemed. The more I tried to rouse him, the more I began to feel a strange sense of unease. Something about this didn't feel normal. I tried pulling him away from the desk, but his hands wouldn't let go of the mouse. It was like they were glued to it. Panic started to rise in my chest. "Max, what's going on? Wake up!" I yanked. Harder, but it was like I was pulling on a mannequin instead of my brother. I turned back to the screen, trying to figure out what was happening. The message was still there. I read it again, but now it felt like the words were seeping into my mind. You cannot log out. The timer at the bottom of the screen caught my eye. It was counting down slowly, from what looked like a random number. Each second that passed seemed to drag on longer, like time itself was stretching. I shook Max harder, my voice rising in frustration. What the hell is going on? But his eyes remained glassy, distant. There was no sign of life in him, no sign of recognition. I was about to leave to call for help when the room suddenly went cold, a chill running through my body. That's when I saw something else on the screen, a new message, appearing as if from nowhere. It read, "You cannot leave until you finish the game. You must complete the quest." This wasn't just a game anymore. Max wasn't just playing Infinity Realms. It was as if he had become part of it, trapped inside. I didn't know what to do. I panicked and reached for his phone, thinking maybe I could get in touch with someone or find a solution online. But before I could do anything, another message popped up, this time in bold red letters. "You cannot save him." I couldn't understand what was happening. This wasn't normal. None of it made sense. I wasn't even sure if Max was still in there, or if the game had already taken him. All I knew was that something had gone terribly wrong, and it wasn't just a game anymore. It was a trap, a digital nightmare, and my brother was stuck inside it. The next day, Max was nowhere to be found. It was a cold, gray morning, and when I woke up, I expected him to be back in his room, sitting at his desk, possibly still fixated on that game. But when I walked past his door, something didn't feel right. The door was slightly ajar, and his room was eerily quiet. I pushed it open, expecting to see him sprawled across his chair, eyes glued to the computer screen, but the chair was empty. His clothes were neatly folded on the bed, his shoes placed by the door, and his phone rested on the desk, untouched. No sign of him anywhere. I called his name, but there was no answer. I checked the rest of the house, hoping to find him in the kitchen or the living room, maybe having breakfast. But nothing. Max wasn't there. Panic began to swell inside me. He never just disappeared without saying a word. I knew something wasn't right. I ran back to his room, grabbed his phone, and tried calling him. The phone rang once before going straight to voicemail. I left a message, telling him to call me back, but as I stared at his phone, the sickening feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I couldn't sit still. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do next. The message on his screen from the night before, "You cannot log out until the game ends," kept flashing in my mind. What if the game had something to do with it? I didn't know how, but that thought wouldn't leave me. Something about that message didn't sit right. It felt like a warning, a command. I grabbed my laptop and logged onto Infinity Realms in an attempt to find out what had happened to Max. Maybe I could figure out where he had gone, or at least what was happening to him. When I opened the game's website, there was no mention of any issues. The reviews were glowing, and the gameplay footage still looked flawless. I scrolled through the FAQ section, desperate for any hint that might explain what I had witnessed the night before, but nothing stood out. I clicked on the support page, hoping for a live chat or contact information. After a few minutes of waiting for a response, a small window popped up, offering me the chance to talk to someone. "Hello, how can I assist you today?" the message read. I typed out my question. "My brother is missing. He was playing Infinity Realms last night, and now he's gone. Can you help me?" I waited for a response, my heart pounding as I stared at the blinking cursor. A few moments later, the reply came. "Your brother is safe. He has simply chosen to continue his journey in Infinity Realms. There's no need to worry." I blinked, rereading the message. I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure of how to respond. The words on the screen seemed strange, almost as if they were scripted, as if something, was trying to convince me that everything was fine. But it wasn't. My brother wasn't safe. He was missing. I typed back, "What do you mean he's chosen to continue his journey? He's gone. I can't find him anywhere. I need help." The response came quickly, but it wasn't from a person. The message was different this time. It felt colder, more mechanical. There is no need to worry. The game will take care of him. He will complete his quest. That is all. The words hit me like a slap across the face. What did that mean? I stared at the screen, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around and wait for him to come back. The game wasn't just a game anymore. It was taking him. It was keeping him. I grabbed my phone again and called a few of Max's friends. They hadn't seen or heard from him either. None of them knew where he had gone. They were just as confused and worried as I was. One of his friends, Dave, mentioned something that sent a chill down my spine. I heard Max was really into Infinity Realms, Dave said. I don't know if I believe it, but some people say once you get too deep into the game, you can't escape. Like, it becomes more real than you think. At first, I thought he was just making it up, but the more I listened, the more it made sense. I had seen it with my own eyes. The game was not like anything I had ever seen before. It wasn't just a game, it was something else. Something that could pull you in, trap you, and not let you go. And Max had been drawn in, just like the others. I decided to go to his room again, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain where he had gone. I sat in front of his computer, staring at the screen that still displayed Infinity Realms. The timer on the screen was still counting. Down, its numbers ticking away slowly, like it was waiting for something. It made no sense. It was just a game. But I had to know what was happening to him. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go in after him. Maybe I could find some way to help him, to bring him back. But I didn't know how. I wasn't even sure where to start. Then, as if the game had heard my thoughts, my phone buzzed. A new message from Max. It was short, but it froze me in place. I'm still here, but I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I read those words over and over, unable to believe what I was seeing. Max was still inside the game, and whatever was happening to him, it was worse than I could have ever imagined. The message didn't end there. Another one came through. The game is changing me. I can feel it, changing me. I felt my heart race. This wasn't just some virtual reality. Whatever Infinity Realms was doing to Max, it was more than just gameplay. It was real. It was pulling him in, breaking him down. I tried to call him, but again, there was no answer. His phone went straight to voicemail. The fear in my chest grew stronger with each passing second. I needed to find him. I needed to get him out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had no idea how to do that. Max had disappeared, and I had no idea where he was, or worse, what he had become. The next few days felt like a blur. Time moved slowly, but my mind was always racing, filled with a growing sense of dread. Max's disappearance wasn't something I could just brush off. He was my older brother, the person I looked up to, and now he was gone, swallowed by something that seemed beyond any logical explanation. Each time I looked at his phone, the last message he sent me lingered in my mind. The game is changing me. I can feel it. Changing me. I didn't know how, but I knew the game Infinity Realms was somehow responsible, and as each hour passed, the thought that he was trapped in some digital nightmare consumed me. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to piece together the events of that night. I remembered seeing him in his chair, staring blankly at the screen, completely unresponsive. The game wasn't just a game, it was a trap. Max hadn't been playing. He had been sucked into it. And now, with no idea where he was or what was happening to him, all I had left were the cryptic messages he sent me. Each one added more confusion, more fear. But one message, in particular, sent a shiver down my spine. It was short, but it was enough to freeze me in place. I'm not alone. There are others here. They want out, too. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Max wasn't the only one. Whatever this game was, it was holding countless others captive. It wasn't just a glitch. It was something far worse. People didn't just play Infinity Realms. They became part of it. And those trapped inside it weren't even aware of how they had gotten there. I couldn't sit around anymore. I had to find a way to get Max out. But where could I even start? I wasn't a hacker, I wasn't a gamer, and I definitely didn't know the first thing about virtual reality or how it could even do this to someone. But I had to try. The messages Max sent me were like pieces of a puzzle, and I knew that if I could just figure out what they meant, I could find a way to bring him back. So I dove into the game myself. I logged on, just like Max had done days before, but I had no idea what I was getting into. The moment I entered Infinity Realms, everything changed. The world around me was so detailed it felt real, too real. The graphics were breathtaking, the environment so lifelike that I could almost feel the wind against my skin and smell the air. But there was something wrong about it. It wasn't just the beautiful landscapes or the cityscapes. It was the emptiness. There were no people around, no sounds of life, only eerie silence. I wandered for what seemed like hours, trying to find something, anything, that would give me a clue about what had happened to Max. But it was like I was walking through a ghost town. No one greeted me. No other players seemed to exist. I kept expecting to find a message or an instruction, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. The longer I spent inside, the more I felt it. The pressure. It was subtle at first, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The world around me felt too real, and yet it wasn't. I could see things, hear things, feel things that weren't supposed to be possible. As I moved through the game, the fear I'd felt earlier began to grow. This wasn't a simple game. It was a world, a vast, open space, and I was part of it. The realization hit me with full force. Infinity Realms wasn't just a game, it was a prison. It had become a living, breathing entity. But what was even worse, it had the power to bend reality itself. I tried to log out, but the option wasn't there. No menu, no prompt, no escape. I checked every setting, every possible exit, but there was nothing. The game had locked me in, just like it had Max. Panic surged through me. I wasn't sure how, but I knew that. If I didn't get out soon, I might never leave. I frantically searched for any way to break free, but the longer I stayed, the more real everything became. I could feel the sun on my skin. I could hear the breeze moving through the trees. But none of it was real. I was trapped in the game, with no way out. Then, just when I thought I might lose my mind from the isolation, I saw something. A figure in the distance, standing alone in the middle of a sprawling desert. It was a silhouette at first, but as I drew closer, I could make out details. A person, standing completely still, unmoving. The closer I got, the more I felt the pull. It was as if I had no choice but to approach. When I finally reached them, I saw that it was a person, someone who looked just as trapped as I felt. It was a man, with hollow eyes, and a face that seemed familiar, yet distant, as though he had been in the game for so long that he was starting to lose his humanity. He turned his head slowly toward me, his eyes devoid of any emotion. "You don't belong here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "What do you mean?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. "This place, it's a prison," he said. "We all came here looking for something new, something exciting. But now we're stuck. And we're not the only ones. There are more of us. So many more." His voice broke and he looked away, as if afraid of something. "Don't stay too long. Don't become like us." I tried to ask him more, to get more answers, but before I could speak, his form started to blur, dissolving into pixels as if he were fading away. He was gone, just like that. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened, when I received a notification on my screen. It was a message from Max. I can see you. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Max. He was in here. Somehow he was still here, and he was watching me. But how? How was it possible? Max, where are you? I typed desperately. I'm here, but you can't reach me. Not yet. The message sent chills down my spine. Max wasn't just a player in the game. He had become part of it. Something more than human. Something more than just an avatar. I wasn't sure what had happened to him, but whatever it wasn't good. I can't get out. I'm trapped. I felt the weight of those words. I had to find a way to get Max out. I had to save him before the game completely consumed him, and before it consumed me too. But the more I stayed in Infinity Realms, the more I felt the game changing me too. The boundaries between the game and reality began to blur. The longer I stayed inside, the more real it felt, and the harder it became to remember that the world around me was just an illusion. It was only a matter of time before I, too, became part of this digital nightmare. The game had trapped me, and I was running out of time. Max had already warned me. He had tried to tell me. And now, all I could do was try to get him out, but it might already be too late. There's a certain kind of quiet that hangs around old libraries, one that's heavy and oppressive, almost like the walls themselves are suffocating. It wasn't just the musty smell of old books or the silence that made it feel like something was wrong. No, it was something deeper, something that seemed to seep into the very air you breathed. The kind of place that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up for no obvious reason. I never thought much of it when I first started. Working there, it was just another job, stacking books, cleaning up the messes left by the occasional visitor. The library was ancient, its creaky floors and high arched ceilings giving off an aura of age that felt like it had been frozen in time. But even though the building had been around for generations, there was one thing that always bugged me: the basement. It wasn't like the others, where shelves of forgotten literature stood in neat rows. No, this basement was filled with dusty boxes, old furniture, and rows of files that no one had cared about in decades. The place was meant to be a storage area, a forgotten corner of the building where no one bothered to go unless absolutely necessary. The blueprints of the building, the official records, didn't list much about the basement. As I looked through them one day, trying to get familiar with the layout of the place, I found it strange that the basement seemed like a mere afterthought. The plans for the library were detailed, showing each section of the building, the rooms, the halls, the staircases. But for some reason, they barely mentioned the basement at all. There were no floor plans for the underground space, no exact details on how big it was or what it was supposed to contain. It was just a blank spot on the map. A shadow in the building's history that no one ever really seemed to talk about. One afternoon, after finishing my usual rounds of shelving books, I found myself wandering the corridors near the basement. Dorser! It was something I hadn't done before, but today there was a nagging curiosity tugging at the back of my mind. Maybe it was the stillness of the place, the silence that enveloped everything. Maybe it was the fact that, despite having worked there for months, I had never really explored that part of the building. Sure, I'd heard the faint whispers of staff members mentioning it, the occasional warning to steer clear of the basement, but no one ever really said why. It was just one of those things you were supposed to ignore, to pretend didn't exist. But there it was, the door, the heavy wooden door that led to the basement. It was old, and not in the charming, historical way you might imagine an ancient door to be. It had an eerie weight to it, as though it had been left untouched for decades, left to collect the dust and grime of time. What struck me, though, was how it felt out of place, almost as if it didn't belong in this part of the library at all. It didn't match the rest of the decor. There were no carvings or inscriptions on the door, No labels indicating what was behind it. Just an old door, standing there like an unwanted secret. I had passed that door so many times before, never giving it a second thought, but something about it today made me stop. Maybe it was the curiosity, or maybe it was the fact that I was alone in the building, with the sounds of the outside world muffled by the thick walls. But there was something different now. Maybe it was the way the door seemed to beckon, pulling me toward it as if it had been waiting for me all along. I walked closer, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. I reached out, feeling the cold wood under my fingers, and I gave the knob a twist. It turned easily, almost too easily. The door creaked open with a groan that sent a shiver up my spine, and I stepped into the dark, musty space beyond. The basement wasn't exactly as I had imagined. Sure, it was dim, with only a single light hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. But what caught my attention wasn't the usual clutter of old files or discarded books. It was the sense of something. There was something in the air, something I couldn't quite place. The room felt strangely oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. I took a few steps further in, trying to shake off the discomfort, but it only seemed to grow stronger with each step. It was as if the basement was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had no idea what I was looking for. There was no reason to go in here, no real purpose to my visit, but still, I felt compelled to move deeper into the space. My eyes scanned the room, landing on a row of metal filing cabinets in the far corner. There was something about them that made my stomach churn. They looked old, rusted even, their drawers slightly ajar as though someone had been in here recently. But there was no one else in the basement. At least, there shouldn't have been. I walked over to the shelves, half expecting them to be filled with dust-covered books or forgotten manuscripts. But to my surprise, they were empty, except for one thing. A single, thin file sat on one of the shelves, a piece of paper poking out from its edges. The paper was yellowed, brittle, and seemed out of place, like it had been there for far longer than it should have been. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the paper, and immediately felt a strange jolt of electricity course through me. The sensation was unsettling, like the room itself was watching me. I quickly pulled the file from the shelf and opened it, praying that it would be something simple, something I could quickly dismiss and return to my usual tasks. But it wasn't. The first page was blank. The second page, too, was empty. And then, as I flipped to the third page, I saw it. A detailed map of the library's layout. But there was something different about it. Something that made my heart skip a beat. The basement was there, but this map was different from the blueprints I'd seen before. It showed the usual shelves, the filing cabinets, but there was a door. And not just any door. A door I had never seen before. It was located at the far end of the basement, behind a set of old shelving units. A door that was nowhere to be found. On the blueprints, a door that shouldn't have been there at all. I froze, staring at the map in disbelief. It was almost as if the building had a secret, one that it was hiding from everyone, a secret that no one was supposed to know. I looked. Around the basement, my heart racing in my chest. The door I had just come through was still standing there. But what if there was another door? What if I hadn't stumbled across everything yet? What if there was more to the basement than I could possibly imagine? As I stood there, the room felt colder, darker. And then, just as suddenly as the thought crossed my mind, a noise echoed from behind one of the shelves, faint but unmistakable. Something was there. Something that wasn't supposed to be. The further I ventured into that forgotten basement, the more it seemed to breathe around me, the air growing thicker, heavier with each step. I could feel the weight of the space pressing down, as though the very room itself was alive, watching, waiting. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. an oppressive, suffocating feeling that made my skin crawl and my heart race. I tried to ignore it, to push through the discomfort, but the tension only seemed to increase the deeper I went. The light above flickered erratically, casting strange, elongated shadows across the room, as though they too were afraid of whatever lurked within these walls. The sensation of being watched intensified, gnawing at me, and my mind kept telling me to leave, to run, but something stopped me. It wasn't just the door I had already found that drew me in. No. Something else was pulling me further into the basement, something that kept beckoning me toward a deeper mystery I had no intention of unraveling. It was the sheer oddness of the room. The longer I stayed, the more the walls seemed to close in, as if the basement itself was shrinking around me. The shelves, though covered in dust and cobwebs, had an unnatural order to them, an eerie symmetry that didn't feel right. As I moved through the space, something caught my eye. An object tucked away in the farthest corner, half hidden behind a stack of old boxes. It was a door, an old metal door that looked completely out of place in a room already filled with so many strange things. The door stood out like a sore thumb, its rusted surface making it seem like it had been forgotten and abandoned for years. Yet there was something about it that made my skin prickle with unease, something that made it impossible to ignore. The door wasn't on any blueprint, nor had it been mentioned by anyone I'd spoken to. It was an enigma, something that shouldn't have been there but was. There was no sign, no label, just an ordinary-looking door, albeit one that was covered in years of rust and grime. Despite the instinct to turn away, to forget I ever saw it, I found myself walking toward it, my steps measured but slow, like a moth drawn to a flame. With each step, the atmosphere thickened, and the whisper of old forgotten things seemed to rise in the still air. The temperature seemed to drop too, as if the room had suddenly become colder, the chill creeping up my spine. The door loomed larger as I neared, its presence dominating the space. I reached out to touch it, the rusted surface cool under my fingers, sending a shiver up my arm. The door didn't budge at first, but after a few moments, I gave it another push. This time, it creaked open with a long, drawn-out groan that sounded far too loud in the quiet, dark basement. The moment it opened, a rush of cold air hit me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Beyond the door was a room that seemed to defy logic. It was smaller than the basement, but it felt far older, almost as though it existed in a separate dimension. The air inside was dense, thick with dust, and something else. Something musty. Something that didn't belong. The walls were covered in layers of grime. The floor was uneven, with cracks running through the cracked tiles, and there was an eerie stillness that hung in the air. But what made it truly strange was the items scattered around the room. Old, dusty furniture that looked like it had been abandoned for a century, cobwebs hanging from every corner, and strange, unfamiliar objects placed haphazardly on shelves. The space felt like an artifact, a forgotten corner of the building that time had left behind, never meant to be found again. I stepped further into the room, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that had settled over everything. As I walked deeper, I noticed something else. There was a shelf at the far end of the room, a simple wooden structure, but it held something that made my breath catch in my throat. On the shelf sat a book. At first glance, it seemed like any other worn old book you might find in an abandoned space, but as I moved closer, I realized it was something more. The book was different. It wasn't just old, it was ancient. The cover was cracked, the edges of the pages tattered and worn from years of neglect. It looked like it had been touched by hundreds, maybe thousands of hands, its history written into the very fabric of its pages. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The moment the book made contact with my hands, I felt a shock, a jolt of energy that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't static electricity. It felt like something far deeper, something far more ancient than that. I could feel it in my bones, as though the book itself was alive, waiting for me to open it. As I flipped the cover open, I found the pages, filled with strange cryptic symbols, symbols that made no sense, like a language I had never seen before. They danced on the page, shifting before my eyes, as though they were alive, twisting and turning in ways that didn't seem possible. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The more I looked, the more the symbols seemed to make sense, as though my mind was slowly unlocking their meaning. But there was something off about it, a dark, malevolent presence that lurked beneath the surface. And then, as I turned to the next page, I saw it. A map of the library, drawn in incredible detail, far more precise than anything I had seen before. But what stopped me dead in my tracks was the way it depicted the basement. It showed every nook, every cranny, every corner of the basement. But then there was something more, something that wasn't on any of the blueprints. It was a door, drawn in a place where no door should have been. It was located near the farthest corner of the basement, behind a stack of old boxes, a door that wasn't marked anywhere else. The drawing of the door was identical to the one I had just opened, the one I had just walked through. The hairs on my neck stood up, and for the first time, I felt a true wave of dread wash over me. The map wasn't just a map. It was a warning. It was as if the book knew what I was about to uncover, and it didn't want me to. As I continued to flip through the pages, I saw more drawings, disturbing, twisted images that seemed to show the library in ways I couldn't understand. The deeper I went into the book, the more the air around me grew heavier, the temperature dropping even further. A low hum started to fill the room, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was as if the room itself was waking up, reacting to the presence of the book, to what I had found. Suddenly, I felt it. A presence behind me. Something was there, standing just outside my line of sight. I could hear the faintest shuffle of movement, the sound of something, or someone, moving in the shadows. My heart raced and I dropped the book, stumbling back, panic flooding my chest. The hum was deafening now, the walls seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing except darkness and the overwhelming feeling that I was no longer alone. The room seemed to close in around me, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But no matter how hard I tried to move, my legs wouldn't respond. I stood there, frozen in terror, as the whisper of footsteps echoed closer. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and with each step, the sense of dread I felt only deepened. My heart pounded in my chest, blood roaring in my ears, but no matter how desperately I tried to move, I remained frozen. I could feel the cold, damp, air surrounding me like a vice, suffocating me, holding me in place as the shadows seemed to twist and stretch, darkening the room. I turned my head slightly, trying to glimpse whatever it was that was drawing closer, but all I could see was an impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow up the light from the flickering overhead bulb. The room had become colder, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. Every inch of me screamed to turn and run, to escape whatever was closing in on me, but I couldn't. It felt as though some invisible force had gripped me, holding me in place, forcing me to face the terror that was about to unfold. The air hummed with an unnatural vibration, and a whisper, faint at first, slithered through the room. A sound so soft and haunting that it barely registered in my mind. It was a voice, low and rasping as though it came from the deepest part of the basement, from some place where light had never touched. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, its rhythm, its cadence strange, foreign, almost alien. The whispering continued, circling around me, moving through the air like tendrils of smoke, curling and wrapping around my thoughts. A shiver ran down my spine, and I fought against the creeping paralysis that had gripped me. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. But I couldn't break free from the pull of that voice, the cold magnetic force that was drawing me deeper into the room. Suddenly, a cold breath brushed against my neck, and I gasped, feeling the hairs on my skin stand on end. It was as if something invisible had pressed against me, something that wasn't supposed to be there. My body went rigid, and the temperature around me seemed to plummet further, as though the very essence of the room had turned against me. A faint light flickered in the far corner of my vision, and I turned, my eyes frantically searching, but the shadows remained impenetrable. There was something there, I was certain of it, something watching, something waiting. The presence behind me was undeniable, and I could feel it pressing closer, closing the distance. Then, with a sudden jolt, the stillness was shattered. The ground beneath me trembled, the walls creaking as though they were shifting, stretching, groaning in protest. A low rumble reverberated through the space, a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the building. It was as if the basement itself were alive, stirring, awakening after centuries of dormancy. The door behind me, the door, slammed, shut with a deafening bang that rattled my bones, the sound so jarring that it nearly knocked me off my feet. I turned toward it, eyes wide with terror, but there was no way out now. The door was sealed, and all I had was the dark, suffocating room filled with the weight of ancient memories and something far darker. The whispering intensified, growing louder and more frantic, as if the very air itself was suffocating under its pressure. The voice no longer sounded distant but was right there, beside me, in the very walls of the room. The words were indecipherable, but there was a tone to them, a command, as though it was beckoning me, calling me towards something I could not comprehend. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter against me with every breath I took. I could hear the faint sound of scratching, like nails on wood, coming from the walls around me. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, a shape began to emerge from the shadows. At first, it was nothing more than a blur, a shifting silhouette that moved unnaturally, as though it wasn't quite bound to the rules of reality. But slowly, inch by inch, it became clearer. It was a figure, tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness that seemed to cling to it like a second skin. The figure moved with an eerie fluidity, as though its body was made of smoke, its edges never fully defined. It hovered just at the edge of my vision, darting in and out of the shadows, always just out of reach. But I could feel it. I knew. It was there, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. My heart raced faster, my breath shallow and quick, but still, I couldn't move. The paralysis was all-consuming, a force stronger than any fear I had ever known. The whispers grew louder, and the scratching, now accompanied by low growls and groans, filled the room with an almost unbearable tension. Then, as if compelled by some unseen force, I took a step forward. My legs moved of their own accord as though they were no longer my own, as though I had no control over my body. I walked toward the figure, my feet dragging on the dust-covered floor, the air thickening with every step I took. The whispering reached a fever pitch, and the scratching became frantic, clawing at the air like something desperate to escape. The figure in the shadows shifted, drawing nearer, its form becoming clearer, and I saw it for what it truly was, a creature, but not like anything I had ever encountered. It was humanoid in shape, but its skin was stretched too tight, almost translucent, with strange, jagged patterns running across it, like the veins of some grotesque tree. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were black voids, reflecting nothing but the emptiness of the room, and its mouth, wide and gaping, held teeth that were far too many, far too sharp. As the figure loomed before me, its presence suffocating, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that it wasn't just a shadow, a trick of the light. It was the shadow, the manifestation of all the darkness that had lingered in the corners of the basement for decades, centuries even. It was something born from the forgotten, from the things that had been hidden and buried long ago, something that shouldn't have been allowed to exist. It was ancient, far older than the library, far older than the building itself, and it was hungry. The creature reached out toward me, its limbs unnaturally long, its fingers curling into twisted, gnarled claws. I couldn't look away, couldn't break free from its gaze, the black voids that were its eyes pulling me in, drawing me closer, as though it were feeding on my fear, on my terror. I could hear it now. The voice that had been whispering in the background was clear, louder, more insistent. It was speaking to me directly, its language foreign, twisted, a promise of something darker, something that wanted me to stay. It wasn't just a warning, it was a command. My body moved on its own accord, stumbling toward the creature, my mind screaming for me to stop, to break free, but it was too late. The air around me was thick, suffocating, and as the creature's hand closed around my wrist, I felt a surge of cold, an icy pain that shot through my body. The room spun around me, and I gasped for air, but none came. The shadows engulfed me, swallowed me whole, and for the first time, I understood. The basement hadn't just been hiding a door. It had been hiding something far worse, a doorway. A doorway that led not out of the basement, but deeper into the darkness that had waited for me all along.